Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf Yudalit. Shavua Tov to everyone, and Mazal Tov on 100 years of daf Yomi learning. The yesterday Tepe Elul was the 100th, the day 100 years ago that daf Yomi was started. So it's definitely a day that we should celebrate and appreciate that began all of the learning for all of us together. So nice way to celebrate. And the Poland trip will be nice because we're doing it in the 100th year, so we'll be able to actually be at the Yeshiva Chochmei Lublin and celebrate, which wasn't exactly where it all started because it was built a little bit after, but it was from Meir Shapiro, who was associated with the yeshiva, so head of the yeshiva. So anyway, very exciting for us. Okay, we're going to get started with yevama niknei b'bi'ah. Today we're finally going to finish this first Mishnah. Okay, we're already in Daf Yudalit. We'll finally finish the first Mishnah and move on to the topic midaf of slaves, Eved Ivri. And we're going to start a whole slew of dapim all about Eved Ivri. But in the meantime, we're on our Mishnah, which started with a regular woman who gets married. What enables the betrothal? Kesef, shtar, and bi'ah, if you remember. And then how does she undo it? Either get or the husband dying. Again, meaning undoing, meaning she's permitted to remarry. So today we're going to do the same thing for the yevama, which was also mentioned in the Mishnah. A woman whose husband dies. Okay, all of this, by the way, was in the Parsha this week. All the marriage and divorce psukim that we've been talking about for months now, and the section on yibum as well. I'm going to talk about today. So yevama is acquired by bi'ah, only through intercourse with the yabam. So her husband dies without children, and it makes sense that it's through intercourse because the whole idea is he's supposed to have a child with her to be named after the brother who never had children. So bi'ah minalam, where do we get it from though? They still want to learn it from a pasuk. Today's all going to be about where do we learn this from, where do we learn that from, etc. Well, we're either going to learn things through psukim or through kal v'chomers, very similar to the way we went through. How do we learn that a woman's betrothed with money? How do we learn with the document? How do we learn through intercourse? So we had all these same type of drashot. Amar kra, yevama yavo aleha ulekachalo liisha. So let's just look at the psukim for a minute. Just going to open them here. So if we see the psukim, we start from the beginning of today's study guide. In Dvarim, chapter 25, it says, Ki yeshvu achim yachdav, umet echad mehem, if brothers are sitting together and one dies, uben ein lo, he doesn't have children, lo tieh eshet hamet chutza li'ish zar, she cannot marry anybody else. Instead, what happens? Yevama yavo aleha, yavo, meaning he will come on her, meaning they will have relations, ulekachalo liisha. So that seems pretty clear. He has relations, and then she becomes his wife. So that's pretty clear that it happens through bi'ah. There's one more word in the pasuk they haven't read yet, which is the last word in the pasuk is v'yibma, and through that it will be yibum. So that word is really not necessary, which is we're gonna deal with that in just one moment. So the Gemara says very simply, yevama yavo aleha. There you have it, through bi'ah. Notice yavo and bi'ah are the same root. Ve'ema l'kulei milta ki'isha. But wait a minute, it says here, likachalo liisha, right? Yevama yavo aleha, which they assume means relations, but then it says, and he takes her to be his wife. So if it says likachalo liisha, why don't we just say, there you learn, any way a woman is taken, meaning betrothed, also the yabam can do it, meaning it could be money, it could be a shtar, a document. So they say lo sakadata. No, we don't think so. Why not? Well, we have a braita that proves that is not the case. So let's read the braita. Ditanya. Interesting. The Gemara's question is exactly the question they asked in this braita. You might have thought that you can acquire yevama with money or a document, but just like you can with bi'ah, Talmud Lamal, where do we learn it from? V'yibma, because it adds this extra word, and he will do yibum with her. And we said before, what is really yibum? Yibum is, right, really the continuation of the next pasuk. Haya b'chor asher teleh, the firstborn, yakum al shem achiv hamet, will be in the place of the dead, right, the name of the brother who died, v'lo yimachesh shmo b'Yisrael, and his name won't be wiped out from Israel. So what do they learn from this? That bi'ah gomeret ba ve'ein kesef u'shtar gomrim ba. That word yibma comes to say only through yibum, which is really meaning intercourse, which means none of the other methods are an option, and we've just proven that. But then they say, wait a minute, but wait a minute, In yevama, we learned something else from this word v'yibma. We learned that yibum can actually be done against the wishes of the woman, as opposed to marriage, which has to be done with her consent. This can actually be done without her consent. So, im kain lemakcha v'yibem. Wait a minute. Okay, and this is going to be something we're going to see a lot in today's stuff, which is how can you learn it from there? We already learned something else from that word, right? We have a general rule that words can only be used for one drasha. You can't learn two things unless we'll see right now, which is im kain lemakra v'yibem. It could have said, if they wanted to learn only one of these things, either right against her will or the issue of it's only through intercourse, then it would have said v'yibem. Why does it say v'yibma, which means right, and he does yibum to her? It's obvious he does it to her. It didn't need to say that. My v'yibma shmat minatarti. So from the way it's worded, the fact that it exists in the pasuk teaches you one thing. The way it's worded could teach you two things, because it could have been worded some other way, and then we learn two things. So we dealt with question number one, which is how do we learn that yibum is done only through intercourse, and that we learn from yevama yavo aleha together with the word v'yibma. That says that's the only way to go. B'chalitza minala. Now the question with chalitza becomes a question. Okay, you can't ask how do you know chalitza. There's a whole ceremony described in the Torah called chalitza, which is if he doesn't want to marry her, then they have to go through the ceremony called chalitza, which is done with the shoe. He takes off his shoes, she spits in front of him, etc. So why are they asking b'chalitza minala? Well, this is the same question we asked way back when about Kiddushin and how the woman gets out of it. And we said, right there, we asked, how do you know, if you remember, we had this crazy question. How do you know if a husband dies that the woman can go get remarried, right? Maybe once she was forbidden to everybody else through the betrothal, maybe his death doesn't undo it, right? It was crazy thought, but that's the same thought here. What happens? The woman, we read in the first pasuk, she can't marry anyone else. She's supposed to do the mitzvah of yibum. Then it says if he doesn't want to do it, then he does chalitza. And if you look in those psukim, and I'll bring them up again on the screen. If you look in those psukim, it's very clear that, here, let's just read. So it says in the first pasuk again that, okay, when we were less focused on it, but lo tiye esha tamei tachutz al isha. She can't marry anyone else. She has to marry the yabam. But then it says, if he doesn't want to, so then they go to the elders, they say, she says, he doesn't want to, he's not interested. They call the Zignei Ro, they speak to him, and he says, in fact, I don't want to marry her. And then she goes to this Kenim, she takes off his shoe, she spits in front of him, and then she says the following declaration, this is what we do to a man who won't build his brother's house. And then he is called in Israel the house of the one who had chalitza done to him. Okay, we're going to darshan a lot of these words going forward. But notice what's missing here. It doesn't say, like it did with get, and then she can go marry anyone she wants. All it says is chalitza is done as an alternative to yibum, and yibum, besides that it permits her, it's also a mitzvah to do yibum. And if you don't want to do yibum, you have to do chalitza. But it never says that the woman can actually get remarried once chalitza is done. She can go marry somebody else. So the Gemara wants to know, where do we know that chalitza permits her to marry anyone else? So again, it's something quite obvious to us, but if you look in the psukim, it actually doesn't say. So now the Gemara is going to explain. Dichtiv v'nikra shemo b'Yisrael beit chalutz hanal. Okay, how do we get it from there? That doesn't really seem to have anything to do with it. It says, right, his name is called in Israel the house of the one whose shoe was taken off. So what do they darshan? Kevan shechalatz banal, once you do the chalitza with the shoe, hutra lechol Yisrael. The one word is really unnecessary in that verse, which is in Israel. Why don't you just say he's called the house of the one who took off the shoe? So the reason, because you say be Yisrael, because the pasuk says in Israel, what it really comes to say is she is now free to marry anyone in Israel. That's clearly not the simple reading of that pasuk. But in the world of drashot, you can do that as long as what? As long as it's not needed for some other drasha. So we're going to go back to that question, which is, what do you mean? Ha Yisrael, ha Yudata. That's what you learn from Yisrael. Hi mebayile lechaditane Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. It's needed for some other drasha, this word be Yisrael. What drasha? Be Yisrael, be Beit Din shel Yisrael, v'lo be Beit Din shel Okay, now here it says in my text, Ovdei Kochavim, but the Hagahot Abba corrects it based on a whole bunch of other girses to a Beit Din of Gerim. Okay, this opens a whole interesting sugya about can converts serve in a court of law? Okay, can they be judges? And there's a bunch of sugyot that discuss this, and there's a bit of a lack of clarity about the issue. So there seems to be a bit of a split among the commentaries. Is it in all areas they can't be judges? Is it only certain areas? Clearly, chalitza, no, because it says it directly here. Because it says be Yisrael, it has to be someone who's born a Yisrael and not someone who converted in. And therefore, a convert cannot be a judge in a chalitza case. There's a whole debate about whether in monetary law they can judge, they can be judges or not. There's a whole debate in general. It's an interesting topic. We're not going to deal with it today because we have a long daf in front of us, but just know that there's a whole debate about if a convert can be a judge at all, and if they can, in what areas are they allowed to be judges. But in any case, here they say the Yisrael is not free for our drasha to teach you, again, that she's permitted to all of Israel now that she got chalitza done, because it's needed for some other drasha to teach you that the judges of chalitza can only be ones who were born as Jews. To which they answer, Trei b'Yisrael k'tive. It actually, if you notice if you have the study guide open, you'll see, and I'll open it here in the screen, you'll see that the word b'Yisrael actually appears, right? It says, Lo yimachesh shmo mi Yisrael, it says, Lakiv shem b'Yisrael, and Nikra shemo b'Yisrael. The ones they're really talking about right now is, Me'en yivmi lakim shem lachiv b'Yisrael, and v'nikra shemo b'Yisrael. Okay, both of those are b'Yisrael, so it says it twice. So now they say, wait a minute, but wait, the b'Yisrael, the second one, the Nikra Shmo b'Yisrael, Beit Chalutz, can't be used for this drasha that we want because it's being used for something else. Okay, so again, we have two. One is teaching you the judges have to be born as Jews, and the other one's teaching you that she's free to marry Jews, right? Any Jew, once she gets chalitza done, which was the whole question we asked. But now we're going to see that one of those psukim is actually needed for a different drasha. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Pamachat, right? We keep quoting Braitot, which darshan those psukim. Pamachat hayinu yoshvim lifnei Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Yehuda says one time we were in front of Rabbi Tarfon, ubati b'malachlot, and there was a case of chalitza that happened. Va'amar lanu, and he said to us, all of the people standing there, anu kulchem v'imru, all of you should answer now, should recite or kind of call the person who did the man who wasn't willing to keep on his brother's name and marry the wife. Chalutz hanal, chalutz hanal. Everybody needs to say the words chalutz hanal, and call him. Okay, where did we get this from? Well, it says Nikra shmo b'Yisrael beit chalutz hanal. What do we learn from there? That everybody actually, not just he'll be known as, but people actually need to almost chant it, right? Say it to him. You're the chalutz hanal. You're the chalutz hanal. So that means that Nikra shmo b'Yisrael is not free for the drasha that we wanted. To which they answer, what do you mean? Hahumi v'nikra shmo nafka. Again, it didn't have to say b'Yisrael. It could just say v'nikra shmo beit chalutz hanal, and from there we would have learned that people need to recite it. The fact they add the word b'Yisrael can be used for our drasha that she's now free to marry anybody she wants. So we've resolved that issue as well. Both Gemaras so far that we saw today, both sections had the same structure. Pasuk, wait a minute, isn't that needed for something else? And then they explained how you could learn both things. Now we're moving on to the next, which is, how else can she get remarried? Bimitat yabam. The other way is if the yabam dies. Now, this isn't fully clear. What it means here is if all the brothers die, it means he has no brothers. Okay, if the husband dies, no children, and he has a brother, and then the brother dies, she's exempt from yibam. If he has two brothers, both of them would have to die. 3 brothers, right? So all those permit her, if the death of all the brothers would permit her to remarry. So if just one brother dies and there's still more, well, right, she obviously has to do yibam with one of the brothers who's still alive. But if all the brothers are dead, that's why it's weird because it's in singular here, hayabam, but it really means all the yevamim died, then she's permitted to remarry. Now again, Minella, where do we get this from? How do you know? Could be you were supposed to do yibam, he died, now there's no opportunity, now she can never marry anyone. Again, to us that would seem absurd, but again, the Gemara is trying to figure out, well, at least where can we derive this from? Kal v'chomer. This time, instead of going with the pasuk, they go with a kal v'chomer. So what's the kal v'chomer argument here? We're going to learn it from a regular woman who's married, whose husband dies, which already we brought up a whole section, which I already mentioned today, to show that she's permitted to remarry. Well, since she's permitted to remarry, obviously the yevama is permitted to remarry. And why is it a kal v'chomer? Ma yeshet ish shehi bechenek mitat habal metirata yevama shehi belav lo kol sheken. Any woman who's married, right, once she gets betrothed, she's now forbidden to all other men under the punishment of strangulation. If she is to sleep with another man, punished by strangulation. Or marry another man. A yevama, it just says, lo tieh eshet hamet chutza li'ish zal. She is not allowed to marry anybody else, but there's no death penalty. It's only a regular negative commandment, which would mean lashes. It's much less severe than death penalty. So what do you see from here? Obviously, it's much more severe, a married woman, and yet she's permitted when her husband died. So obviously, yevama, which is a less severe penalty, would obviously be permitted to her to marry anybody else she wants once the yabam dies. So now they're going to try to reject this kal v'chomer in two different ways and say this isn't a good kal v'chomer because, again, it was clear here that eshet ish is more strict and yevama is more lenient. But if we can prove that there's something lenient about eshet ish that's not true for yevama, then we can knock out the kal v'chomer. So we're going to have two attempts to knock out this kal v'chomer, but both attempts are going to be rejected. We'll be left with this kal v'chomer, and that will prove our point. So now they want to suggest, but wait, a married woman can go out, can be free by a get. If you give a get to a woman who's a yevama, it actually doesn't permit her to marry anybody because a get is not relevant to her. Now, it happens to have certain effects, which means they can't actually do yibum. They would have to do chalitza. We learned all this in yevama, but it doesn't permit her. So if the get permits a married woman, that shows that it has some leniency that this one doesn't have. So therefore, you might say, well, if she doesn't go out beget, maybe she doesn't go out when he dies. So, right, go out meaning can go out and marry anyone she wants. To which they say, that doesn't prove anything because hanami yotza b'chalitza. It's true she doesn't leave by get, but she has chalitza instead. In other words, get and chalitza are basically not the same, but they're on equal standing. So that basically puts the kal v'chomer back in place and we're good to go. But another question, well, what happens with a married woman? She gets betrothed, then already she's forbidden to everyone else. When that man who forbade her dies, then she's free. That's not the same as yibum. Because when did she get forbidden to all other men? When she was betrothed to her first husband. Then he died. She had to do yibum because they had no children. And now the yabam is the one whose death is supposed to permit her, but he wasn't the one who forbade her. So maybe he's not the one who can permit her. So maybe his death doesn't permit her like an eshet ish. To which Rav Ashi has a good answer to this. Amar Rav Ashi, hanami osra metira. It is the same person who forbids her who's now permitting her. Why? Yabam osra, yabam sharila. Because the yabam really is the one who forbade her. Now, what do you mean? Didn't we just say she was forbidden from the time of the betrothal to the first husband? But if he had children, or if he had no brother, let's go with that one even more, he would have permitted her, right? So now he dies. What forbids her at this point? It's true that at point A, when she got betrothed, it was the husband, the first husband, who forbade her. And he's not the one who's now dying to permit her. It's the brother. But when he died and he had a brother, the existence of the brother is what forbade her now to marry anybody else until yibum was done. So in fact, he's the one who right now forbids her, because if he didn't exist, she'd actually be permitted to marry. So he's the one who forbids her, and therefore he's the one who permits her. So in fact, it's just like eshet ish, and therefore we can go back and reinstate this kal v'chomer. Okay, so that was, we did, again, what did we deal with so far? We dealt with really the rest of that Mishnah, which was yevama nikneh b'bi'ah. How do we know she was acquired by bi'ah? We got an answer to that. Again, we had some questions, but we resolved them, right? Isn't that drasha needed, that word needed for something else? Then we got to, how do we know the chalitza permits her to remarry? And how do we know that the death of the husband, the death of the yabam also permits her to remarry? Which again means all the yevamim that exist, all the brothers, permits her to remarry. Okay, that was what we proved. Again, first two drashot were from words in the psukim. The third one, the last one about the death, was a kal v'chomer from a married woman. Now, since we already brought up this issue that One is with get, right? We were comparing the Eshet Ish to the divorced, the Eshet Ish to the yevama, the married woman to the one who has to do yibum. Now we're going to, and one with get and one not, right? And that one's with chalitza and not with get. We're now going to ask the obvious question, which is, how do we know a yevama doesn't, like, why doesn't it work with a get? And why doesn't a married woman, why don't we do chalitza to undo her marriage? So that's going to be the next two drashot, which will kind of take us till the end of this section and the end of our mission. Utehe, so we're having these two kind of side questions. And not only that, but besides that, they're building off on this comparison that we made in this Kal V'chomer, they're also going to bring other Kal V'chomer arguments that theoretically you could have made and ask, why aren't we making those Kal V'chomer arguments? If already you just prove this with a Kal V'chomer, let's take a Kal V'chomer argument and take it to an absurd place. Or I don't know, maybe not absurd, but maybe it could have been logical, but it's certainly not what we do. So why don't we say that a married woman can do chalitza to get out of her marriage? Okay. So what do they answer? Here's our kal v'chomer. A yevama doesn't use a get to get out of it, and yet gets to go out with chalitza. So so a woman who can go out with a get, if get works, then maybe other things work as well. Then maybe chalitza should work as well. Right? That's the kal v'chomer. To which they say, very easy answer here, Amakra sefer kritut. No, because what does it say by a married woman? Spent a whole masechet on this. You need a book of kritut. Sefer korta ve'ein davar acher korta. It's a book that separates them and not anything else. So chalitza is not going to work. Taking off a shoe is not going to do it. Okay, that was pretty easy. The next one's going to be much more complicated because we're going to actually need three different answers because the first two are going to be rejected. So now why don't we say, right, let's do the flip. Why don't we say that the yevama gets to leave, right? She can go marry anyone else as long as the yabam gives her a get. Well, here's the kal v'chomer. Right? It's the reverse of what we just did. A married woman, chalitza doesn't work, but get does. So zoshi, chalitza, the one who chalitza works, which it doesn't work in the other one, and yet it works here. So shouldn't we say get? Right? The whole assumption here, just like the previous one, is if it's easier to get out of this, then maybe it should work getting out of it in any kind of way. So Amarkra, first answer, Amarkra kacha. V'kacha ikuv. First, we have to understand two things. One is, what is kacha? Kacha, it says, this is, do you remember she says, kacha yaseh li'ish, very much like Haman in the whole story of the Megillah. But anyway, we're not focusing on that now. Kacha means, this is what you do to the man who, right? This meaning, this is what you do to the man who doesn't want to marry his brother's widow. This meaning, this li'ikuva. And no other way. This is the only way to do it. That's how they understand this. So this assumes a certain assumption. The next section of the Gemara is a teeny bit complicated. So I want you to get the assumption here. The assumption is, very clearly, the assumption is we have a kal v'chomer, but the kal v'chomer is overridden by a word that means it has to be done this way. And that can override a kal v'chomer. The Gemara is going to question that assumption right now, although it'll take a little while till you see the whole picture. If there's a word that means it has to be done this way, that overrides a kal v'chomer argument. We're going to see somewhere where it doesn't. Okay, and the structure is going to be like this. They're going to have a word that's ikuva, which means it has to be done this way. Then they're going to suggest a kal v'chomer, and instead, now what you would expect is they would say, "Oh, there's a word ikuva," and that overrides the kal v'chomer. But they don't do that. They actually find other words there in the psukim that override it, which means that the ikuva word, the one that means it has to be done this way, is not strong enough to override a kal v'chomer, because if it was, you wouldn't need to darshan it from some other pasuk. So the conclusion is going to be the same here, which is it doesn't work, the kal v'chomer, but for a different reason, because of some unique pasuk there, not because of the word that indicates it has to be done in this way. That's the basic concept. The other background you need to know is that if you remember from Yoma, if you learned Yoma, or not, if you know about the laws of Yom Kippur in the time of the temple, there were two seirim that were taken, two goats, and they would do a goral, a lottery. Which one goes to God and is offered as a korban chatat, the sin offering, and which is the one that gets thrown off the cliff, goes la'azazel. So they do it all with a goral. and they don't do it with kriyat shem. Kriyat shem would mean a designation of the Kohen, saying, let's say the Kohen Gadol says, oh, this is the one I'm using for the chatat, and this is the one I'm using to throw off the cliff, right? So it's not done in that way. Theoretically, it could have been, but it's not. So let's read the sugya now. So they say here, Ha-Yom Kippurim, dichtiv goral v'chuka. It says it needs a goral, and it also uses the word chuka. And when we get to Kodshim, we're going to learn that Seder Kodshim, which we have a while to get there, but we're going to learn that chuka is a word when it comes to sacrifices. When it says chuka, this is the law, it means it has to be done in this way. Vitanya, so the goral already has a word of it has to be done in this way associated with it, just like kacha. Vitanya, and it says in a Braita, va'asahu chatat. Now the real drasha is going to come from these words. He does the goral, it says in the pasuk, and then it says va'asahu chatat, and then the one that becomes the sin offering, that is taken to be the sin offering. What do we learn from here? Ha-goral oseh chatat ve'en Hashem oseh chatat. The goral is what makes it a chatat and not calling it by name. If the Kohen just decides by himself, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, says, this is going to be for chatat, you can't bring that as a chatat. Only the goral. Now, here comes the kavachomer. Sheyachol v'halodin. You might have thought it's a kavachomer. Now we're going to compare it to a different case. If you, let's say, you take an oath on something that you're going to do and then you didn't do it. So I swear I'm going to do something and then you don't. So you bring called a korban levi yored. It's a sliding scale offering, which means if you can't afford the animal, you can bring 2 birds. And if you bring the 2 birds, one is onola and one is a chatat. One is a burnt offering and one is a sin offering. How do we determine? There's 2 possible ways you can determine. Either when the owner who's supposed to bring the sacrifice buys the pair and calls one, this is called kriyat shem, says, I'm buying this one for chatat and I'm buying this one for the olah. That could be. What if you didn't? Then when the Kohen gets the sacrifice and he gets the birds and he decides to, oh, I'm bringing this as the chatat and this is the olah, then it's determined. So it's called either lekichat balim when they purchase it, or asiyata kohen, or when the Kohen does the sacrifice. So they say the following. Here comes the kavachomer. Now, if they did a lottery for the 2 birds, it wouldn't work. Okay, it's not effective. And yet, Kidesh Hashem, but calling it by name works. So makom shekidesh goral, in a case where the goral does work to do it, ein nodin shekadesh Hashem, shouldn't it also work by doing it by name? Right. By the way, all this means is it can't be, you can't switch it around at that point. In other words, it's a done deal. So if it's a done deal without a goral, but yes, Kidesh Hashem, by calling it, then in a case where it says you could do it also with a goral, right? You could do it with a goral. Why don't we understand that means also with a goral, either goral or by calling it by name? Now, if the logic of our previous section had stood, what would we say? Kacha li'ikuva. We would say chuka li'ikuva. And it has to be done this way because it says chuka. But instead of saying that, it learns it from a different pasuk. Talmud lomar va'asau chatat, because it says, and he makes it a chatat right after the goral was mentioned. We learn from here, goral oseh chatat ve'eno shem oseh chatat. Only the lottery makes it a chatat and not calling it by name. So here the Gemara is going to just say what I already said, which is Tama demiyate kra. This is all because the pasuk specifically came and said so. But halav hachi, were it not for that, we would have darshin on kavachomer af agav dichti bechuka. We would have been able to make the kavachomer argument, even though we have this word meaning it can only be done this way. So it can only be done this way. This liikuva word shouldn't really override a kavachomer, in which case answer number 1 is rejected. Okay, again, what was answer number 1? It says kacha, and that's how we know chalitza is the only way to get out of it and not get. So we can't learn that. So now we have to figure out, how do we know a yevama can't be released by a get? So we have a different pasuk. Pasuk we know very well. Amar kra la velo liyivma. This we learned many times in Gittin. It says v'katav la sefer kritut. He writes a get for her. That means for the woman who's getting divorced. Specifically for her, not for a yevama. And from there we exclude the yevama. But what's the obvious problem with this? We already know this word because we've darshaned it for a very famous drasha. Ve'ema la lishma. But it says la to teach you something else, which is it has to be written for this particular woman. Remember, if he has 2 wives with the same name, or he has a friend with the same wife's name and he wrote the get, and then, or he had the get written for him and then he finds it in the garbage and he pulls it out and he wants to use it, he can't. has to be written specifically for him and for her. So that's what we learn from Lishma. So the answer, atre laktive. It actually says la twice, because if you remember the psukim there describe, he divorces her and then she gets remarried to someone else and he divorces her. So la appears twice there. So because of that. So then so there's two laws. One could be for this, one could be for that. But we're still going to have a problem here and eventually reject this answer because there's a different drasha we learn from La, which is you can't write a get for a woman for two wives at the same time. Rashi says we're talking about a case where you had two wives with the same name. Okay, imagine how complicated it is with two wives, have two wives with the same name, even more complicated. But he actually can't divorce them by saying, I'm divorcing you and you, because let's say Rachel and Rachel, and then give them both the same get, because it's not clear which one is which. Rachel is referring to which wife. Okay, that's the way Rashi understands this. There's some other ways of explaining it, but we'll leave it at that right now. So basically, it's not free. Ela amar kra na'al. Na'al im midach nilo. So they go back to the yibum psukim and they say answer number 3 to this question, which is actually going to work, even though we're going to have some questions on it as well, which is we learn it from the fact that it has to be done with a shoe, and therefore only a shoe and not a get. So now they say, wait a minute, the word na'al in the section where it talks about that you need the shoe and he has to take off a shoe, wait, comes for this. We have a different drasha coming from the shoe. We need it for the following bright. Again, we keep having the same structure over and over again today. Na'alo. Now, in one place it says his shoe. So from there you would say ein lo ela na'alo. Only it has to be his own shoe. He has to own it. How do we know that he doesn't actually have to own it and he could use a shoe of somebody else's? Because it says na'al, it teaches you that the word na'al comes to include even someone else's shoe. And one place it appears his shoe. The other time it just appears as shoe. Because it appears as shoe, you learn it could be anyone's shoe. Well, then the obvious question becomes, so why does it say his shoe then, if it could be anyone's shoe? Well, it has to be na'aloha ra'oilo. It has to be appropriate for him. What does that mean? It's going to mean a few things. Number one, again, we're now very off topic. This was just the word na'al can't be used to teach chalitza is the only way to get out, and not any other way because it's used for this other drasha. It can't be too big on him that he can't even walk in the shoe. It can't be a shoe that's too small that it barely covers the majority of his foot, or it doesn't cover the majority of his foot. And prat lemesulayim. Okay, now we're on Amubet. It also comes to exclude a shoe with a sole that doesn't have a heel. Okay, there's a few different interpretations of what exactly this means. Maybe it's like a flat shoe, which doesn't have a heel coming out of it. Maybe it's a shoe that got worn away. The heel got worn away. And yes, from your question, the Beitin had a special chalitza shoe and they always use that shoe. But this is kind of before maybe that was all established and they're just describing, or let's say you don't have that option. So what are the laws about shoes that you can use? So what do they say? The obvious answer, if na'al is used for that drasha, so how do we use it for this drasha? Well, im kein yichtov kra na'al, my ha-na'al, shmami natarti. Just could have said shoe, but the pasuk actually says the shoe. From the fact that it says the shoe teaches you two things. So in the end, we get the reason why we know chalitza is only chalitza and not get is because it says the shoe. Okay, from there we learn it has to be done with the shoe, it can't be done with the get. Okay, we finished our whole section, which was very simple structure. How do we know yibum is acquired through intercourse? Yevama is acquired through intercourse. How do we know that she's free to remarry once there's chalitza? How do we know she's free to remarry once the yevamim are all dead? Right, if they die before they do yibum. And then we had these two side questions. How do we know that an shadish can't get divorced through chalitza? And how do we know that the yevama can't get divorced, can't get permitted to remarry with a get? That was today. Now we're moving on to Eved Ivri, the next Mishnah. We finally get to the next Mishnah. And before we do that, we need to do some introduction. Okay, there's 5 sections actually about Eved Ivri in the Torah. We're going to read through them right now. Okay, some of them. Okay, so let's see. We start off with Shmot in Parshat Mishpatim. It talks about ki tikne Eved Ivri, when you acquire an Eved Ivri. Okay, now notice it says when you buy, okay, you acquire. The assumption of the Gemara is going to be that this category is discussing someone who gets sold into slavery because they don't have the money to pay for something they stole. Okay, and that comes in Shmot Parakaf Bet in verse 2. If there's talking about a thief, Shalem Yishalem, he has to pay. Im ein lo v'nimkar b'gnevato. And if he doesn't have, he gets sold. okay, because of something he stole. So if someone purchases, and then the rabbis are going to assume that this section is talking about that kind of slave because he's purchased, meaning it sounds like somebody sold him. Who sold him? The court. Okay, when you acquire a slave, he works for you for 6 years. I'm just paraphrasing the psukim. Okay, in the 7th year, he goes free. If he came in, okay, I'm not going to translate this next pasuk because we're going to have a whole drashot on it in a few days. Anyway, when he gets in there, the master could give him a wife, and meaning shifcha Knaanit, a Canaanite slave, to breed more children that actually end up staying with the original master. If the Eved says at the end of the 6 years, I love my master, I love my wife and my children, I don't want to leave here, so Higisho Adonav El Elohim, they take him to the court. Elohim here means court. Higisho Ladelet Olam Mezuzah, they bring him to the door, or the mezuzah, the doorpost. V'ratzah Adonav et ozno b'maratzeh, he pierces his ear, and then he stays forever. Forever later, they're going to interpret means really he goes out at the Yovel year, but that doesn't come from the section, even though he does go free in the Jubilee year. That's learned out elsewhere. That's the first section. If we skip for a minute to Dvarim chapter 15, it's also talking about that same kind of Eved. Which is if you, a man or a male or a female gets sold to be a slave, again, assuming the court sold them, or with her, it could also be her father. Again, it says the 6 years. Here there's an added halacha, which is you're supposed to give him gifts like severance pay when they leave. You leave, he leaves with gifts. You have to remember you were slaves, etc. Okay, and then it also talks about there that you can pierce his ear if he wants to stay longer. Okay, this is why they're repeated and why that it's a whole separate question. We're not going to get into that right now. Then if you go back to Shmo Kaf Aleph, the second type of Eved Ivri is an Ama Ivriya. And this is a man sells his daughter to be an Ama. We already learned this already. And the idea is that in the end, he'll probably marry her or marry her off to his son. That's Yehud. But if he doesn't, then, right, Hefda, Behefda, remember this word, we're going to get back to it today, which we already darshan this word before, right? He redeems her. She can redeem herself. She can buy herself back if she wants. Okay. And then, right, based on how many years are left and all that. Then we skip to Vayikra Kafhe. So we have, one is a slave that gets sold because they didn't have the money to pay for a theft. 2 is a woman gets sold by her father. 3 and 4 are both the person runs out of money. Okay, they're very poor. They're in a situation of poverty and they sell themselves to be a slave because they can't afford to live. So that's in Vayikra Kafhe, verse 39. And verse 47. Okay, both of them, if he's poor, he gets sold to you, you have to treat him well. Doesn't say anything there about the 6 years. There it specifically mentions the Yovel. He goes back in the Jubilee year. Okay, then we have in Mem Zayin 47, it talks about what if he's sold to a non-Jew. Okay, it says there, and the rabbis understand that to mean not a convert, like a Jewish convert, but someone who's a Gentile. Okay, maybe a ger toshav living in the land, keeping the 7 Nochai laws. And eker mishpacha ger actually means they're not a Jew at all. They're an idol. They're not a convert at all. They're an idol worshiper. So this is all Gentile. You're sold to a Gentile. So there's 4 sections. You could be sold. The last 2 we already reviewed. The first 2. The last 2 are you're poor. You sell yourself to be a slave, either to a Jew or to a Gentile. So now with that introduction, we're going to get started. There's 2 ways it can be acquired, either with money or with a document. And he gets free bishanim, either 6 years or up, biyovel in the Jubilee year, or if he buys himself out, like let's say there's 4 years left, he'll buy himself out for 2/3 of the price that he was sold for. She gets one other way that she gets released, which is she is sold as a minor, but when she reaches the age of puberty and he doesn't decide he wants to marry her or marry her off to his son, then she goes free. If you get your ear pierced, so you're acquired, meaning you, after the 6 years, you're supposed to go free. So how do you need to get acquired again? You do that by getting your ear pierced. And he acquires himself either in the Jubilee year or when the master dies. So now we're going to talk about Eved Ivri Nikneh B'Kesef. The Gemara is going to say, where do we get that he's acquired with money? Minalan, Amar Kra, Mikesef Miknato, Milamed Nikneh B'Kesef. They say, it says, okay, now we have to open the psukim to see. So it says at the end of the last section that I mentioned, in Vayikra Kafhe Pasuk Nun Aleph 51, where it's talking about someone who's acquired by a Gentile, In this, it's all talking about redeeming, because there it really wants to encourage your family members to redeem you. If there's many years left, then mikesef yashiv gulato mikesef miknato. You have to buy him back from based on the original price. So again, if there's 4 years left, or 10 years left, so you buy it based on you do proportionally how much, right? You deduct how much he worked, whatever's left, you pay. Now, what does it say there? From the money he was used to be acquired. So there you see, it must have been acquired with money. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute. And this is why I set up the intro the way I did. That's only mentioned in the section where he's sold to a Gentile. Okay, because in general, all kinyanim with Gentiles, in general, kinyanim acquiring, we're going to get to all this later, but can be done with mashicha, usually pulling, all sorts of other ways. When it comes to a Gentile, only with money. So since in general things are acquired with Gentiles with money, that's why an Eved Ivri is acquired with money. But how do we know if you're sold to a Jew? Amar kra behefda. So now they quote the pasuk by the Yamayvriya, which says behefda. Now there, we already learned this, which is we deduct the amount, right? The owner, the hefda, it's actually referring to the owner, as opposed to it should really be her. She redeems herself, or someone redeems her. But here the subject is the master. What did we learn? He deducts for how much she worked. So again, what do you see? Deducts from what? From the amount of money that was used to acquire her in the first place. So we now taught it by the Ovei Kochavim, and we're going to have to get to all four basically. Now the Yamayvriya, but we were asking about an Eved Ivri, not an Yamayvriya. So the Gemara says, Eshkachan Yamayvriya, ho'il mekachah b'kesef, mikniyah b'kesef. Well, remember, the Yamayvriya is sold in the end really to be betrothed in the end. And women in general are betrothed with money. So that might make sense for her. But it doesn't really make sense. Again, we're still going to need to have a different drasha for an Eved Ivri. There's no Kiddushin for him. So Eved Ivri minala. Amar kra, ki yemacher lecha achicha ivri o ivriya v'avatcha shesh shanim. Now we go to the Psukim in Tvarim. What does it say there? If your brother is Jewish, or your sister who's Jewish, right, or Ivriya, right, your brother who's either male or female. So what do you see here? Makish ivri leivriya. So whatever's true for her is going to be true for him. And remember what we said that section was talking about, if you were sold by the court. So we now got three. We have sold to a Gentile out of poverty, sold to a Jew if you're an Amai Ivriya, sold to a Jew if you got sold by the court. If the court sells you. Now, what did I tell you before? Often, let's say with an animal, you pull the animal and that's how you acquire him. Money doesn't work. So maybe in Eved Ivri, we don't allow pulling, we do it with money, because if he's sold by the court, he's sold against his will. But mocher atzmo minalan, right? And then he could run away, right? He won't let you pull him. So that's why we allow it to be done with money. But if he's selling himself, where he's not going to go against it because he decided to do it, how do we know that maybe he needs to be pulled or something like that? To which we say, Yalif Sachir Sachir. We have a Gzera Shava, Sachir Sachir. Okay, this I put in blue on the sheet. Sachir appears both in the pasuk of Vayikra Kafhe, the one right where he sells himself into poverty because of poverty, and Sachir appears in Dvarim Tevav in the last pasuk. So because Sachir appears in both places, we have Gzera Shava. We can learn from one to the other, and from there we get Dvarim Tevav. I'm sorry, Vayikra Kafhe was where he sells himself, and Dvarim Tevav was where he's sold by the court. We already proved where he's sold by the court, so from there we learn to the last one. Okay, so that's how we get the last one. But they say, Ela lamanda lo yalif Sachir ma'ika lamemar. But wait, not everybody holds by that Gzera Shava. Okay, so again, let's just look at the chart at the bottom of this page that I set up here. If you're sold to a slave, we get it from Kesef Miknato. Amai Ivriya, because it says Behefta. Sold by the court, once we have Amai Ivriya, we learn to the Jewish. If he sells himself, either Sachir, okay? Oh, actually, right. Sachir also appears in the Gentile. I actually put the wrong one. It should be Kimei Sachir Yihiyeh Mo. It's learned actually for the Gentile one. I should have put that one in blue. Okay, and then Mocher Atzmo Amar Kra. So if you don't learn Sachir, where can you learn it? Amar Kra V'chi Tasig. Okay, what's that? the last section about the gentile starts with a vav, end. End connects it to the previous, which means once you know the gentile is only in kesef, then we're going to connect it to the earlier section. That's what it says in the next few words. Musaf al inyan rishon v'yilamed inyan el yomi tachton. It's added to the previous, and then we're going to learn the uppercase from the lowercase. So we're going to learn basically the section before from the section after, because of the vav connects the two. So that's how we get, if you sell yourself into poverty, also you're acquired with money. Okay, that's the end of this section. We now proved all 4 slaves and how they get sold by money. But now the Gemara is going to go off on the side, which is going to take us a while longer and into tomorrow's daf, which is Umay Tana Diyo Lalev Sachir Sachir. Who's the Tana who doesn't hold by this Gzera Shav? Gzera Shavas were always passed on by tradition. Who's the one who doesn't have this tradition? So they suggest, we're going to have suggestion number 1 today, and then rejection of suggestion number 1. Hi Tana hu de Tanya. It's the Tana who appears here. It says in a Braita, and this is going to connect with the psukim and how I set them up before. Hamocher atzmo, someone who sells himself, nimkar l'shesh v'yeter al shesh. If you sell yourself out of poverty, you can sell yourself for 6 years, for 7 years, for 8 years, for 9 years. The whole 6 year and you leave after 6 years is not relevant for someone who sells himself because of poverty. Mecharuhu beitin einonim karela l'shesh. But if the court sells you, then it's only 6 years. And now we're going to basically set up 4 differences between if you sell yourself and if the court sells you. And it's based on those psukim that I showed you, all the laws that were mentioned in Shmot and Dvarim that don't appear in Vayikra, don't appear there aren't relevant there according to Tanakama. So, if you sell yourself, you don't get your ear pierced. But if the court sells you, then you do. If you sell yourself, then they don't give you a severance pay when you leave or this gift. But if your court sells you, then they do. That was mentioned in Dvarim only. So if you sell yourself, then you don't get to mate with the shipcha knani that's living there. But if you get sold by the court, then you do. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Zev Zainonim Karela L'Shesh, Zev Zen Yurtza, Zev Zen Mani Kimlo, Zev Zen Rabban Moshe Lo Shipcha Knani. All 4 laws that we just discussed are relevant for all Jewish slaves, whether the court sold you or whether you sold yourself. So basically, we have this machloket, to which the Gemara says, "Ma'ila ba'ka miflagezat," not the machloket. Did Tanakama lo yalif sachir sachir? Rabbi Elazar yalif sachir sachir. So maybe I was right actually from before, because the sachir, that's why I did mark those 2 off. So I'm undoing it. The sachir is actually learned from the Eved Ivri and Dvarim Tepa to Vayikra Kafhe. So basically what they're saying is, if you have the Gzera Shavas sachir, then you're going to learn everything about the Eved Ivri that gets sold into slavery, the 6 years, the gift, the piercing the ear, and the shivcha knani. You're going to learn all of that from one to the other. And if you don't have the Gzera Shava, then you're not. So that seems like an easy split. And then we have our answer. Who holds by the Gzera Shava, who doesn't hold by it? But Amar up to Yomi Mishmedu Abaye. No, Dekula Amayalev Sachir Sachir. Actually, he says they both hold by the Gzera Shava. That's not the machloket. Okay, if you look at the end of the chart, their machloket is based on something else entirely. What's their machloket based on? This next pasuk. Everyone thinks there is a Gzera Shava, but there's a special reason to say, according to Tanakama, that certain laws only apply. And we're only going to get to the beginning of this, but we're going to go through all 4 laws by tomorrow. How we know by each one, it's only true for that case, even though there is a Gzera Shava, but we don't use the Gzera Shava for everything because of these drashot that basically limit. My time at Tanakama, how do we know that the first one, selling for 6 years, is not relevant for someone who sells himself? Because if you sell yourself, right? It says va'avadcha. This is in Dvarim. It says he works for sheshani, meaning he and not anybody who sells himself, meaning only this kind of slave and not another one. V'idach, what is Rabbi Eliezer or Elazar? There's actually a debate which one he is. Va'avadcha lechavalo liyoresh. It's to tell you that it doesn't go, if your master dies, it doesn't go to his heir. Now, this isn't 100% true. If he has sons, it goes to his sons, but you don't get passed on to a daughter or a brother. Let's say he doesn't have any sons. V'idach, where is that law learned by Tanakama? Avadcha acharina ktiv. There's 2 times where it says avadcha. You can go look back in the psukim and see them. And v'idach, what does Rabbi Elazar have to say to that? Lahartzaat adon huda'ata. Okay, let's stop here and we'll explain that tomorrow, because we did a lot already today and it's kind of late. Anyway, what we have here is we were just trying to figure out who's the Tana who doesn't hold Sachir. We had an attempt to say it and we rejected it. And we say their machloket is based on something else. And we'll continue this discussion tomorrow. Wishing everybody Shavua Tov and a good day. Nice to be back and a long daf for today.